The victim mindset is comfortable because it feels good. It feels good because it removes responsibility. Hello everyone, welcome back to your regularly scheduled self-reflection. I am Tash and this is Things We Say in Therapy, a place to feel seen, to learn some psychology and to self-reflect on some hard truths to improve your mental health. I am feeling like shit today. I'm pre-period, it's friggin' hot where I live and I've just been so busy. I forgot to take my medication yesterday. It is ridiculous and I feel like trash, so just bear with me. I may not sound as enthusiastic today, but I hope you still enjoy the episode. If you're watching me, I'm sorry. Nah, fuck that. I'm not going to apologize for the way I look. That is misogynistic. Okay. So this is yet another episode about what can happen when your pain and your trauma that is not dealt with becomes your identity and controls your life. As you can probably see from the title, we're going to be talking about the victim mindset and why it feels so comfortable, why it's so hard to let go of. It starts out as a protection technique, a self-protection technique, a coping mechanism. It protects you from uncomfortable emotions, from feeling bad, from having to take responsibility and accountability for things that you do. It stops you from having to deal with confrontation and conflict with the people that you want in your life. But eventually it turns into a cage. It stops you from forming authentic relationships, from having deeper bonds with people, because you have this wall built up to protect yourself. You become emotionally unavailable in order to save yourself from feeling discomfort. Just to clarify from the beginning that this does not make you a bad person. Like always, my episodes are never about shaming or blaming anyone. It's just purely psychological and mental health information to help people realize their potentially toxic or unbeneficial patterns within their lives, to improve relationships with themselves and with other people, and help to deal with discomfort. This purely means you have unresolved trauma, things that you haven't dealt with that need to be dealt with in order to improve your life. It is not your fault what's happened to you for you to develop these coping mechanisms, but once you recognize the pattern, it is your responsibility to deal with it. This is uncomfortable on purpose, so let's call it like it is. So the victim mindset is not about you actually being a victim. It's not you actually experiencing harm in the present. It's you clinging on to past trauma and past harm and shaping your identity around that trauma and pain to feel powerless, framing things in a way that convinces you that things are always happening to you, which shadows you from having to take responsibility for anything. The victim mindset is chronic externalisation of your problems. It's an external locus of control. If you did psychology in high school, I'm sure you've heard that term before. But chronic externalisation is constantly seeing yourself as acted upon, as being wronged, as being misunderstood by people, or being targeted. If you listen to my last episode about how I am someone who calls things out, I've definitely had friendships and relationships in which the other person has felt targeted by me because they failed to see how their actions contributed to the conflict between us. And so me confronting them about that conflict just constantly felt like an attack, which over time felt like me targeting them, because if you fail to see the way that you've contributed to something, it will just feel like you're constantly being misunderstood, constantly being attacked and wronged, even when your own behavior has contributed to the outcome. This is the victim mindset. So the trauma that has happened to you is the reason why you've developed this mechanism and the victimhood mindset. But the victimhood mindset is what you're doing to shield yourself from the pain that you experience from the trauma. It's how you're shielding yourself from it long term so that you don't have to deal with it. Other common behaviors and signs that you or someone around you is exhibiting the victim mindset is constantly thinking, Why is this always happening to me? Constantly outsourcing the responsibility for change, never putting in the work to change your circumstances, even when you're unhappy, and blaming others for where you're at. Another one is commonly interpreting feedback as an attack. See episode 20 about why we get defensive, and episode 16, I want to say, about having honest conversations with the people you love. People in the victim mindset also are constantly waiting to be rescued, be chosen, and to be validated in order to feel like things are getting better. They're waiting for someone else to save them. People stay in this mindset because the brain will always prefer a familiar hell over an unfamiliar peace. Even painful patterns feel better to the unhealed mind than uncertainty. People with unhealed trauma who develop these coping mechanisms struggle to change because change means uncertainty. It means you don't know what's going to happen. And so because you've lived in this toxic behavioral pattern for so long, even though it's harming you and your relationships and people around you, it's easier to stay there and know what's going to happen than strive for change and feel that uncertainty. Because positive change it feels so far from reach, because if you've experienced significant pain and trauma, you've likely never had peace. If you're unhealed, you've never experienced peaceful circumstances for long. So it feels unreachable. It feels like if you dive into change and adapt healthier coping mechanisms, you don't know what's going to happen because you've never experienced the other side. Your nervous system will keep you in a destructive loop because that is where it feels safe. So let's get into why the victim mindset feels so comforting for people who are in it and why it's so hard to get out of it. The first reason it feels so comforting is because it explains everything. You can use the victim mindset in every scenario. You don't have to sit in ambiguity. You don't have to do the work to figure out why you've acted that way, why someone else acted that way, and what contributed to the situation that you're in. Every outcome has a villain. There is someone to blame in every single situation. You can just outsource that blame, and that explains why you feel bad, because you're being targeted, because you're being wronged. No thoughts needed. It's easy. Easy explanation. The second reason is that it removes agency. It removes responsibility. It's never your fault. So you never have to change or take responsibility or apologize for your actions. You never have to feel bad because you had no control over it. Reason 3 is it protects your self-esteem when you have low self-worth. You didn't fail, you didn't do anything wrong, you were sabotaged, you were attacked. When you can't handle a hit to your ego without it completely devastating your sense of self, you will protect your self-identity at all costs, this identity that you've built around your pain, because it's so fragile. If you were to take any responsibility, if you were to feel any kind of uncomfortable emotion that would mean you did something wrong or that you've hurt somebody else or whatever it may be, that identity completely shatters. Even if this involves lying to yourself and lying to other people, even if deep down you know that you have contributed to this in some way, the brain can do miraculous things. It just jumps into victim mindset because it's self-protection. Reason 4 is that it guarantees sympathy. Pain becomes a currency to get attention, and the attention that you get from being the victim becomes your proof of self-worth. Because you have such low self-worth and self-esteem when you're in the victim mindset, you need that external validation, that attention, in order to feel like you're worthy as a person. You get those classic external validation cravings, for example, when you're in a relationship and your partner has, complimented you that day, they're in a great mood, they've made you feel wanted, they've made you feel loved, you feel great. But when your partner's in a bad mood and they've said something that hurt your feelings, they've not responded to you in the way that you wanted them to, then you feel anxious, you feel depressed, your mood is completely ruined for the day. A lot of people who are like this tend to tell a lot of people everything, and they form friendships through gossiping and sharing information because they need a lot of people in their proximity to tell their story to get their side of the story out in order to get sympathy, in order to get attention, in order to have the one up and make sure people know that they're the victim in the story, because that gives them that external validation they need in order to feel worthy. Victimhood offers this certainty of a conclusion. It offers the certainty that you'll get sympathy, that people will feel bad for you. You get that respect without having to do any of the work or grow at all. Again, bearing in mind that the type of victimhood mindset that I'm talking about isn't intended manipulation. It's a survival technique that's outlived its usefulness, like most toxic adult behaviors, but people can use this victimhood mindset in order to manipulate people, in order to turn things around on you on purpose and gaslight you and make you feel bad. What I'm talking about, and like in most of my other episodes and topics, I'm talking about the unintended results and effects of this behavior when people do it subconsciously as a trauma response. So I used to be in a toxic loop of picking emotionally unavailable men as partners. In my early 20s and my late teens, I would pick men who I didn't vibe with, people who didn't match my emotional needs, probably because I was also a little bit emotionally unavailable, but I used those relationships as validation that I was worthy. It did absolutely nothing for me. I chose awful men, or men that, weren't ready for a relationship, just bad matches, and would complain when things weren't working out, when they were treating me poorly. I would get upset every time things didn't work out. But I did absolutely nothing to change it, because change felt too intimidating, felt too scary. So I would just blame them, even though they weren't free of blame, they weren't free of responsibility for their actions. However, I refused to accept how I contributed to my unhappiness after choosing those people to be with, to spend my time with. And it kept me in a loop until I got fucking real and said, you need to stop victimizing yourself. I was intentionally single for a while after that, and I think it did significantly help me get out of that loop. A lot of the victim mindset that I'm talking about is people who are not able to deal with uncomfortable emotions and discomfort to do with themselves and their identity. They're never able to have hard conversations or have a productive, deep conversation about their behavior because they're unable to see how their behavior contributes to anything bad. They're not able to see their self-identity in a light that sways even a tiny bit from that delusional self-identity they have, in which they can never do anything wrong. Other benefits of being in a victim mindset for the people who are in it are avoiding hard conversations, never risking failure, never outgrowing people, never having to deal with the pain of change, moving on, ending relationships and friendships. If a pattern stays, it's doing something for you, even when it's toxic and unhelpful in the long run. If you are keeping a pattern, there is some sort of benefit to you of that pattern. We stay in these patterns for years because we don't want to do the work, because the work is hard. We don't realize that on the other side of that difficult and painful, potentially painful change is a lot more happiness and a much better life. So why do these chronic victims struggle to see that their behavior is wrong? The first one I have is that it protects their identity. So like I've mentioned, if someone's core identity comes from being the one that always gets hurt, being the one that is always attacked or targeted, then admitting that they're the one who caused hurt or contribute to it in any way causes an identity conflict. They experience a cognitive dissonance in which the reality contradicts their self-image. So to reduce that discomfort, they subconsciously minimize their actions, minimize their contributions. They rewrite the story in their head. They focus only on what the other person did, or focus only on their feelings and how they felt, or they contribute any kind of feedback about them and their behavior as an attack. It is psychological self-protection most of the time. A lot of the time people don't realize that they're doing this, and it can feel like manipulation, but bear in mind that there is nuance to that, and sometimes people aren't doing it intentionally. Emotional intelligence is being able to understand that even though it is hurting you and it feels a certain way, it's not always intentional, and there is a multitude of reasons why something is happening. The second reason that victims struggle to see that their behavior is wrong is avoiding shame. So underneath the chronic victim mindset is usually deep shame that comes from not feeling confident in who they authentically are. If you secretly feel like you're unworthy, you're unloved, or you're a bad person, then acknowledging that you did something wrong can absolutely annihilate you. It's so painful that it is avoided at all costs. The psyche defends itself by justifying what they did, by blaming other people, by deflecting the blame, or by moralizing their actions, saying, I only did this because of this, and this. It's seeing things only in a way that justifies their behavior. To them, it feels safer to feel wronged and attacked than it does to feel flawed. The third reason that I mentioned before is the external locus of control. Some people believe that outcomes are primarily caused by external forces, and they struggle to see where their own actions contributed to the outcome. This can develop from chaotic or unpredictable childhood environments, overly critical parenting, or repeated experiences of powerlessness. If you constantly felt powerless growing up, this becomes your comfort zone, which then can develop into the victim mindset because you're constantly rendering yourself powerless. If your life historically felt completely out of your control, your brain then defaults to this happened to me instead of I contributed to this. And this pattern of external locus of control can continue long after you begin to have agency over your own life. The fourth reason I have is emotional reasoning. So when someone feels hurt by something, their nervous system can interpret that as proof that they'd been wronged, as proof of injustice. The logic becomes, I feel hurt, therefore I was wronged. The feelings that you have become intensified because you don't know how to rationalize them. And those intense feelings then become so big that they overpower your ability to self-reflect on them. Those hurt feelings are just evidence that you've been attacked, that you've been wronged. I'm pretty sure I've spoken on this story previously, possibly in my episode about getting defensive, but I knew somebody who really struggled with conflict and shame avoidance and their self-identity perception. And so every time I would come to them with an issue I had with their behavior, or there was, an argument of some sort in which we misaligned, every time they would feel hurt by something, they would label the other person as rude, as mean, as the villain, instead of contemplating why they felt those hurt feelings and how this situation, these circumstances contribute to their hurt feelings. They would just see themselves as being attacked. This is the same concept. Reason 5 is using defensiveness as a self-preservation technique. Being able to analyze and see your own behavior requires the ability to emotionally regulate, having the capacity for guilt without having a complete meltdown and self-identity crisis, and a relatively secure attachment to yourself, feeling secure in yourself. If someone lacks those, accountability feels scary and like a threat to your self-identity. So when the nervous system feels a threat, feels danger, it deflects, it attacks, it gets defensive instead of being introspective and perceiving the nuance of the situation, because it can't handle the discomfort of the guilt or the shame or whatever feeling comes up for you when you take accountability. And reason 6 is learned relational patterns. If someone grew up in an environment where responsibility was never modeled in your caregivers, there was lots of blame and deflection and criticism, and conflict meant that you would get punished or that you would be to blame, that then equates accountability as humiliation, as a threat, as scary. So you resist it automatically. You resist taking accountability because to you that equals blame, that equals criticism, that equals punishment. So I'm just going to repeat again the important nuance of the victimhood mindset and the fact that it's not always subconscious. There is a distinct difference between people who have truly experienced pain and trauma and haven't processed it, and therefore subconsciously are in the victim mindset as a self-protection technique, and someone who weaponizes victimhood so they can have power over you, so they can belittle you. So how does the victim mindset impact relationships? People who are in the victim mindset can sometimes be the person who one-ups you all the time. They always have to have it worse. They always have to be the victim in something, which causes people who are in relationships or friendships with that person to feel invalidated, to feel a bit exhausted from everything always feeling like an argument, like a competition. People who are unhealed generally, but obviously specifically in the victimhood mindset, can feel resentment towards people who heal, who embrace change. They can automatically feel defensive in the sense that they feel small, they feel judged, they feel belittled for not changing and for staying in that mindset and repeating the behaviors that they're in that aren't beneficial to them. It is a mirror to their patterns. Something else to recognize is also shared outrage. So people who are in the victim mindset can tend to test people's loyalty, because obviously they feel insecure within themselves and therefore within their relationships. So because it's so common for these people to share their stories where they're the victim, where they've been wronged, disagreement can feel like invalidation. When they don't get the external validation from someone after telling them a story and that person doesn't share their outrage, they feel unjustified, and that then feels like a threat to them, which then in their mind makes you disloyal. It can make them feel like you are abandoning them. So let's talk about why it's so hard to move on from the victim mindset. Now, this is not an excuse to keep going with it. This is just a psychological insight. Maybe it can help you develop compassion for people who are going through this. When you leave the victim mindset, you grieve the familiarity of your behaviors, of constantly being the victim. You have to embrace change, discomfort, uncomfortable emotions. And once you start taking responsibility and having accountability for your behaviors and actions, you'll start to remember the things that you did in the past that you didn't take accountability for. And once you've been doing it for such a long time, it can feel too overwhelming to do that. And so you just have to keep going the way you were going. You also may have developed a community, friends and family members that is built on shared pain. I know that I definitely built a community of people who were in as much pain as I was, which made it that much more difficult to move on. It felt like I was losing everything, including myself. There's also moral clarity. Once you exit the victim mindset, you realize that there's nuance to almost everything. And your rigid view of the world that you use to self-protect falls away from you. And that takes a lot of bravery to deal with, to have a complete shift in your mindset. and your worldview. If you've recognized yourself within the things that I've spoken about, that doesn't make you a failure, that doesn't make you a bad person. It just means you're waking up to patterns, which it takes a lot of bravery. The victimhood mindset doesn't dissolve overnight, and it doesn't have to be as intense as I may have described it. It is a spectrum, like most things. If you've recognized anything that you exhibit within what I've said, that's okay. You have to practice having agency over your life, and you don't have to be perfect. No one is. You don't have to be mean to yourself. You can carry compassion and responsibility at the same time. Thank you so much for listening to episode 22 of Things We Say in Therapy. I'm sorry if it was a bit skewed. My mind is not all there right now. I've done my best to try and explain things. I'm sorry if it was a bit muddled. I really enjoy talking about these topics, and I really hope that I'm helping people. If this felt uncomfortable, that means something clicked. Sit with it. I'll see you again. Bye.